the combat mechanics in Breath of the Wild can often feel truly limitless. There's so many different approaches a player can take, utilizing the myriad of different weapons, abilities, and boosts to conjure up some unique combat possibilities. But regardless of your current skill with this combat system, what good is being a great swordsman if you don't understand the theory behind the weapons you use? As in this game, there are dozens of unique ways to boost a player's damage output outside of just using the base weapon, through stat buffs, elemental effects, critical strikes, and even weapons with secret damaging capabilities, which are all crucial to understand. But the problem is, the game is reluctant to inform the player on how exactly most of these attributes can affect damage output, as the only damage stats that are available to the player are the base damages of the weapons themselves. So in an attempt to figure all this information out, I decided to test out every single one of these damage altering properties, in order to decode how exactly these things can affect a player's damage output. And the results are surprising to say the least, as not only was I able to figure out the exact stats behind every single damage dealing method in the game, I even figured out how all these attributes can stack on top of each other, which allowed me to push damage numbers in the upper triple digits and sometimes even passing 1,000, which is absolutely insane for this game. So utilizing this research, I thought it would be helpful to go over the hidden stats behind every single damage boosting property in the game, explain how each of them can stack amongst each other to maximize damage output, in order to ultimately figure out the maximum amount of damage a player can deal in this game. So without further delay, let's get into the hidden damage stats of Breath of the Wild. To kick this off, let's start by explaining some of the most utilized damage boosting attributes in the game, which are the damage buffs. This is going to be a bit of a recap from an earlier video, with a few extra added details. So the standard attack buff, which can be obtainable through either food, armor, or a combination of the two, comes in 3 different potency levels, and each level of this buff increases nearly all forms of damage output by a set percentage level. A level 1 buff increases it by 20%, level 2 by 30%, and level 3 increases it by 50%. There are also 2 other main damage buffs that can be found in this game, which are Ancient Proficiency, the set bonus for the Ancient Gear, and Bone Attack Up, the set bonus on the Radiant and Phantom Ganon sets. Ancient Proficiency increases damage output for all Ancient and Guardian weapons by 80%, and Bone Attack Up increases damage output for all Bone and Dragon Bone weapons by the same 80%. And just like the standard attack buff, they are allowed to stack on top of just about every other boost in the game, even including the base attack buff. So for an example, if we used an Ancient Sword, which has a base damage of 40, while we have both the attack up and Ancient Proficiency buffs activated, the 50% from the attack up will add to the 40 to create 60, and the 80% will add to the 60 to create a final damage output of 108. What's interesting about the way this is calculated is that every single buff is factored in on top of the last one to get a higher damage, opposed to just applying them both to the base value of the weapon and adding them together, which would in turn net a lower output. This means that all damage boosts stack multiplicatively amongst each other, which allows for increased damage output numbers the more boosts you have applied. So with this in mind, let's go over another type of attack boost found within this game, which are the critical hits. Now, a critical hit is defined as a damage boosting move that is usually achieved by performing a special action, unlike a buff that is tied to the player themselves. And in this game, there are a total of 4 main ways that allow a player to execute a standard critical hit. 1. Breaking a weapon on an enemy, whether that be by throwing it or just using up the last hit. 2. Getting a headshot with the bow and arrow. 3. Striking an enemy with a weapon while on a horseback or the master cycle. And finally 4, getting the last hit in a combo with the critical hit modifier applied to your weapon. Each of these moves multiply player damage output by 2, which stacks with a lot of the other damage boosting attributes such as the buffs we mentioned earlier. So with that Ancient Sword combo we were using in the past example, if we were to, let's say, attack with it on horseback with the other 2 buffs applied, the critical modifier doubles our damage output from 108 all the way to 216. But beyond the main types of critical attacks, there are many other unique ways a player can obtain a critical hit depending on the weapon or circumstance, despite sometimes boasting a different damage modifier. Boomerangs, for an example, always deal 50% more damage when thrown at an enemy as opposed to directly striking one, and hammer-type weapons such as the Boulder Breaker and the Stone Smasher deal double damage when used against the tallest enemies. The only exception being the standard Iron Sledgehammer, which instead deals 4 times the normal damage, which is super good if you're trying to take these baddies down early game. There's even a special damage modifier when landing headshots on enemies that spawn on archery towers that increases damage output by a whopping 10 times, which basically guarantees a one-shot KO to any enemy in this position. And just like the others, they are allowed to stack with any of the other buffs or critical hits that we mentioned earlier. So in reality, all these damage boosts should be quite simple to understand, because as long as you know the values of the boosts, calculating them together to figure out the damage output is really straightforward. However, there are some types of critical attacks that don't work quite as normally as you would expect, and feature slightly altered rules on how they can be stacked with other boosts. One of them being shattering a frozen enemy, which multiplies damage output by 3, and another being performing a sneak strike, which multiplies damage output by 8. What makes these so unique, besides their high multipliers, is that they override any and all critical hits that would otherwise be applied. So shattering a frozen enemy with a headshot or breaking a weapon during a stealth strike will not deal any more bonus damage, but they can still be stacked with all damage buffs such as attack up or ancient proficiency. Other than that, these critical hits are still a great way to drastically increase the damage output of a weapon, and understanding them will lead us one step closer to figuring out the maximum amount of damage that can be achieved in this game. But moving on, the next set of damage boosts we should talk about refers to a very specific set of weapons practical to the mid and late game, which are the Sheikah ones. We already discussed how the Ancient Proficiency buff increases damage output of all Sheikah weapons by 80%, but most of these weapons also receive many boosts of their own that can stack even further. In this case, when facing any Guardian type enemy, all Guardian type weapons deal out 30% more damage, and for the Ancient weapons, aka any of the ones you can buy at Robbie's Tech Lab, deal out 50% more damage. These two types of criticals can stack with any type of attack buff or critical hit, with the only exception being the Ice Shattering critical we mentioned earlier, which completely overrides it. And this brings us to the final type of Sheikah weapon to discuss, the Ancient Arrows, which contain a lot of unique and hidden properties that differentiate them from most other weapons. Its most obvious capabilities being its ability to one-shot a Guardian when fired in the eye, 3-shot it when fired at the body, and even their ability to instantly vaporize any non-boss type enemy in the game, at the cost of it not dropping its loot. However, when this arrow is used against any boss type enemies such as a Talus or a Hinox, these arrows boast a different effect, by increasing the base damage of the attack by 50%. On top of this, since Ancient Arrows are classified as a type of ancient weapon, you can even use the Ancient Proficiency buff to get an extra 80% power added to your attack, along with any other buffs or criticals you apply with it. Now, using them against these bosses may not be the most cost-effective use for this item, but by far its most practical application is when it's used against the Guardian Scout, as these arrows deal an additional 30 damage to the base attack of the arrow before receiving most of its buffs, which really helps its damaging potential. To put this all in perspective, let's utilize an Ancient Bow, which has a base damage of 44, with the arrows and all possible damage boosts, to see how much damage we can crank out. First, we will add the Ancient Arrow bonus of 50% to get 66, then the attack up bonus of 50% to get 99. Next, the 30 bonus damage for hitting a Guardian Scout gets added to create 129. Then, since it's an ancient weapon used against a Guardian, we can add another 50% to get 193. And finally, with the Ancient Proficiency buff, we can add 80% to crank this all the way to 346, which is insane for a single attack in this game. Oh, and yeah, if that shot was a headshot, the entire thing will be doubled to get 693, which is in fact the second most powerful bow attack possible in the game, right behind shooting a normal Guardian in the eye. In fact, this exact combination is so powerful that the devs even applied a hidden nerf to it, by reducing the Ice Shatter multiplier with an Ancient Arrow blow from 3 down to 2, so it's best not to use ice with this combo. But enough talk about what the maximum bow damage in this game is. Because what about the maximum amount of melee damage? This information may come off as a huge surprise. So in order to figure out the maximum possible melee damage in Breath of the Wild, let's first try to figure out what the highest damaging weapons are. In terms of raw attack power, the most powerful weapon someone can find is the attack boosted Royal Guards Claymore, which can deal up to 116 damage with the max modifier. Utilizing everything we discussed about buffs and criticals earlier in the video, there's two boosts we can use in tandem to maximize this weapon's damaging potential. The attack up buff and the sneak strike critical, which does 8 times the damage. Using this combo, we are able to crank out a total of 1392 damage while sneak striking, which can basically one-shot just about any normal enemy in the game. However, considering that the Royal Guard's claymores are both rare and weak on durability, a much more realistic option would be to use the Savage Lionel Crusher, which is much more common late game and boasts a vastly higher durability. Although the base damage of this weapon is only 108 instead of 116, with the 2 previous buffs applied, we are still able to deal out 1296 damage, which is enough to take out any normal enemy in the game excluding the Gold Moblin, which boasts a crazy 1620 HP. So the question becomes, is there a way we can deal even more damage to possibly one-shot this type of enemy? Fortunately, there is one more weapon we can test out, which is the Guardian Axe++, which has up to 75 base damage with the max modifier. Although this damage is significantly weaker than the other two, there is one very important buff that this weapon can utilize that the others cannot, Ancient Proficiency, which gives a crucial 80% buff that adds to the other two. So, for the moment of truth, if we use this weapon to sneak strike the Moblin with both buffs applied, we will deal exactly 1616 damage, which is in fact the maximum possible damage in this game. It's unfortunate that this number is only 4 short of being able to one-shot this type of enemy, but at least it brings it down enough to guarantee that your follow-up hit will kill it. So now that we know how to create the highest damaging combos in the game, keep in mind that a lot of these setups are rather situational, but a great understanding of all the different buffs and criticals that we went over so far, along with how they all stack together, will allow you to increase your combat efficiency by drastic levels. But beyond just the typical melee and ranged weapons, there are many other ways a player can deal damage to an enemy, through things like bombs, elemental effects, and powers that are all viable means of attack, despite never showing any proper damage indicator like the other weapons. Although none of these attacks can be boosted from any form of buff or critical, I thought I would take a minute to run through some of these hidden stats. One of the big ones being Urbosa's Fury, which deals 150 damage to any enemy in its influence regardless of type. The only exceptions being Taluses and Hinoxes, which get dealt 300 instead, and Lionels, Moldugas, and Guardians, which each get dealt 500 when in the influence of one. The remote bombs each deal 12 damage, with the upgraded variants dealing 24. Shield Surf Spinning and Swim Dash Spinning only deal a mere 5 damage, so these attacks really aren't viable at all. Trampling an enemy with the horse always deals a flat 30 damage, and running over an enemy with the Master Cycle deals 5. Master Sword Beams deal 10 damage at its base state, or 20 when powered up, which can each be increased by 50% with the Beam Up buff. And last but not least, the Lionel Shields deal damage while parrying in multiples of 7, with the base variant dealing 7 damage, Mighty dealing 14, and the Savage dealing 21. The only bonus stats we aren't covering today are the elemental ones, as we already made a huge video about them and the multi-shot bows a few months back, which I highly recommend that you check out after this one. The only reason why that info wasn't covered today is because the stats behind those are far more complex and time consuming than anything we have discussed in this video, but I'll leave a card in the upper right if you would like to increase your knowledge on this subject further. But with that said, thank you all so much for watching. I am so proud to announce that my channel has recently hit 25,000 subscribers on YouTube, which is honestly amazing. I would have never expected to get this far on the platform, and it's all thanks to your wonderful support throughout the past years, and especially these last couple of months. If you enjoy the type of content I put out, please feel free to leave a like on the video and subscribe if you haven't already so you won't miss any of it to come. Also, a huge thank you to my amazing patrons and YouTube members who help greatly support the channel. If you are interested in contributing for as little as $1 a month, all the info can be found in the description below. Anyways, thank you all so much for watching, and I'll see you guys in the next one.